Reasonably Thoughtful is a place to discuss current events unfiltered by the one-sidedness emanating from the two extremes. Here we delve deeper into the context, nuance, and trade-offs of the issues than what is usually reported in mainstream media. This is a location for open discussion from a multitude of backgrounds and viewpoints. Comments are encouraged. Disagreement with the creator or with each other is allowed as long as it's respectful. Disrespectful comments will be removed, and repeat offenders will be banned. Politics is an important but highly controversial endeavor. Civil discourse is its foundation, and we all need to be able to maturely discuss and disagree, and be open to education and persuasion if we hope to coexist relatively peacefully.
So today on my ESPN feed, I had this article sort of jump out at me, and I want to talk about this article, but I actually want to use it as a springboard for talking about women's athletics in general. In fact, we'll talk about that first, and then we'll come back specifically to this article. So let's start out with talking about what makes girls' athletics so great. And I think that there's quite a lot of things that we can look at here to talk about why girls participating in sports is a really good thing. I think most of us could probably agree that our society tends to put a lot of an emphasis, particularly for women, on appearances. And so sports really gives young girls something else besides just their appearance to pay attention to feel good about, to devote themselves to something and feel better about themselves. So sports can be really great for that. They also, of course, tend to make a person healthier because when you're competing in sports, you're getting lots of exercise. And the better you become at it, the more devoted you become, the more likely you are to have, on average, a healthier lifestyle and be a healthier person. So it obviously can contribute to health. I think it goes well beyond that, though. I think that it's really good for developing friendships. I think it's great for, going through that kinship that develops between teammates. It's really good for learning a healthy outlet for competition. It teaches you how to be a good winner. It teaches you how to be a good loser. All of these things can be really, really good for young women. So what message are we sending then if we say that we are allowing trans women to compete in women's sports? That's really the question, the broader question that I want to get to here. Now, first thing I want to do, as always on this channel, we want to talk about trade-offs. We want to talk about the greater context. We want to talk about nuance. So we don't just want to talk the talking points that we hear from the two different sides. I think these days, for the most part, you're going to hear a lot of the extremes, but not a lot of the nuance in the middle. So let's talk about that. And I think anytime you talk about trans issues, the first thing that you really need to start out with is that we should be treating trans people like all people, people of all groups, majority or minority. We need to treat trans people with dignity and respect, which is something that I'm afraid far too often folks on the right who are generally against, let's say, the progressive side of different trans issues, LGBT issues, things like that, they tend to not treat, almost to dehumanize, but to not treat trans women or trans people in general with dignity and respect. And that's something that we should always do. However, having said that, just by acknowledging that you need to treat people with dignity and respect, that doesn't mean that you need to adopt a whatever they want to do, regardless of the implications, we should be okay with. And it's difficult to find what exactly the right line is. So that's what I'd kind of like to dive into here. So let's talk about women's sports, and let's talk about the message that you send to. Well, first of all, I'll tell you what. Let's talk about this article first, and then we'll launch from the article into the bigger picture. So, Penn to ban trans women from women's sports. Ends case focused on Leah Thomas. So the interesting thing about this is the University of Pennsylvania. The very interesting thing about this is, of course, University of Pennsylvania is an Ivy League school, and we generally think of Ivy League schools as being super liberal or super progressive, or at least that's what I think a lot of conservatives would like you to believe, is that Ivy League schools, just like most schools in general, are just way too liberal. There's no open discussion. There's no free speech. You pretty much have to be a liberal. Obviously, that's a bunch of nonsense. But in any case, we do, I think, generally think of the Ivy League schools as probably leaning liberal. And so it's interesting when you see a story like this come out, which is the University of Pennsylvania modified a trio of school records set by a transgender swimmer and said it would apologize to female athletes, quote unquote, disadvantaged by her participation on the women's swimming team, part of a resolution of a federal civil rights case. Okay, so I think that's a good way to jump into the specific issue here, which is it fair to allow trans women to participate in competitive athletics? And the fact that you're seeing even an Ivy League school acknowledge that no, it's probably not. It's probably not right. It's probably not just to allow records that are set by others to be broken by a transgender swimmer. This is unfortunately the blurry area, right? These are the trade-offs that we have to talk about, because there's no side of this issue that you can pick where there aren't any trade-offs. And so by deciding that we're no longer going to allow trans women to compete in women's sports, it is obviously hurting someone. It's hurting those transgender women who would like to compete in women's athletics. Now, I think, as a lot of people would point out, certainly in terms of college athletics here, NCAA Division I competition, there's very few people that this actually impacts. Having said that, it is a major, major issue that is being discussed on a regular basis these days within the United States of America. I personally believe it had a very strong, let's call it an outsized impact on the way that the last election went. And it's because of sort of an inability for us to talk about the context and the nuance and the trade-offs of issues like this that leads us to a situation where people by default are just going to vote a particular way without a full understanding of the issue. All right, so in this particular case, I think this is one that you'll probably see the majority of Americans would agree with what the University of Pennsylvania did here. They would agree, and I'm talking about the majority, across all political spectrums, just and across people who don't really think of themselves as being of a particular political party, think of themselves as being fairly apolitical. I believe from everything that I've heard that the majority of Americans believe that that trans women should not be able to compete in women's athletics. I'll go ahead and say, because it's probably fairly clear by now, from my perspective, I am one of those. I believe that women's athletics, which we've already talked about how good they are, it's watered down when you're basically sending the message of it doesn't matter, sending the message to the young girls out there, the young ladies, the young women who are training in a particular sport, and you're sending the message of it doesn't matter how hard you train, you're going to be probably second best because you're not going to be able to compete with somebody who was born a man and transitioned over to be a woman. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality. So we need to talk, like so often is the case, we need to talk about this particular issue from both a policy standpoint, is something good or bad policy, and then also from a messaging standpoint, is it good or bad messaging? You can have good policy with bad messaging. And this is something that Democrats in particular need to pay attention to, because they're on the losing side of this issue and several others. Whether they think their policy is good or not, they're definitely on the wrong side when it comes to the messaging. An example that I like to use a lot to kind of step away from trans women and talk about a different issue. An example of good policy but bad messaging is police reform. Police reform, I believe, would be good policy. There's definitely opportunities there to improve the way policing is done. However, defund the police is bad messaging. That was whoever came up with that particular slogan set their calls back by leaps and bounds, because it's just terrible messaging. So it pretty much ended any serious discussion that we could have had about the need for police reform, because it allowed people who were opposed to police reform to sort of exaggerate the point of view of the people who were adopting the defund the police. And you have to admit that that slogan is very easily misunderstood. So that's an example of good policy with bad messaging. So let's talk then about allowing trans women to compete in women's athletics with the question of, is it good policy but bad messaging, or is it bad policy? And my viewpoint is it's probably bad policy. And I think University of Pennsylvania has agreed with that in their action here as well. And obviously there's lots of others that agree with it. So why is it bad policy? It's bad policy because of what we just said a minute ago. You're basically telling young women that we don't really consider women's athletics to be as important as men's athletics, because we're going to go ahead and allow sort of this gray area of whether or not, transgender women should be allowed to compete or not. We're not going to let that issue stop us from allowing them to compete. Okay, rather than talking through, really the fairness of it all, it's just sort of, I think, been dominated by, no, we just need to allow trans people. We're living in a progressive era. We just need to allow trans people to compete. And I think it's coming from a place of tolerance. It's coming from a place of, like I described earlier, treating people with dignity and respect. But the problem is there are consequences to it, right? And so you're sending the message to young women who want to compete, but are unfortunately then put in a position where they're looking at their competition and thinking, I don't have any realistic way of legitimately competing against that, in most cases. And what you're basically telling them is that they need to be quiet, that their voice is not important enough to be heard. So I believe from a policy standpoint, you can see why people would be up in arms about this. There's not a lot of examples of this genuinely causing problems. It certainly is an issue that has been blown out of proportion by the right. But the reason why it's been blown out of proportion by the right is because it's a winning issue for them based on the way the lines are currently drawn. And like I said, the lines are currently drawn because of this inability for people on the left to acknowledge the trade-offs. So that, obviously this is a little bit more subjective, and I certainly welcome people who would like to argue with me here on, in the comments of this video about why I'm wrong, about why it really is good policy. I'm open to persuasion on this one, but that's the way that I see it right now. As always, if it wasn't clear from the very beginning, please feel free to disagree with me. Please feel free to disagree with each other. Just do so respectfully. Okay, so anyway, so that's the policy standpoint. Is I think we can acknowledge sort of, if we can step back and look at it just from a purely from a sense of fairness, we could see why trans athletes, trans women would have an advantage over regular, young girls competing in these sports. And in fact, that's why we see records being broken left and right. However, let's get to the messaging point then. So even if you do genuinely believe that the policy would be good, let's talk about the messaging. And what I'd like you to do is imagine, if you're not already in this situation, imagine yourself in the shoes of the parents of a young woman who's competing in college athletics and has all of a sudden run into a problem like this, where you would have been first in a particular competition, or you at least have a chance of becoming first in a competition because you're really good at whichever sport you're talking about, but you're going up against a trans woman who is just, physically stronger than you are. And so the best you can hope for is to finish second, or, as has happened already, you have already finished second, or maybe you had a record broken by someone, and so you're now, you're no longer the best at that particular sport, at that particular event. So you're the parents of that person, and so your daughter comes home from college, or she calls you from her dorm room or whatever, and she's upset about this. If you haven't done a whole lot of research, a whole lot of thinking about this, if you're not the sort of person who can remove yourself from the subjective aspect of an issue, but you can purely look at things objectively, what's the big picture here? Which I think is most people, right? Most people don't completely remove their own personal circumstances from the issues when they think about them. Then what's more likely to be your reaction? Are you more likely, as the parent of this upset young lady, is your reaction more likely to be, well, let's look at this as an opportunity to show tolerance, to show respect for a person who's probably going through a lot of things in their lives, and so we realize that it's probably not 100% fair, but ultimately they're in a difficult position. The school's in a difficult position. The organizers of the event are in a difficult position, and so while society is still working through these issues, let's err on the side of tolerance and dignity and respect. Or is the reaction more likely to be that you're pissed off, that your daughter, you don't like the fact that your daughter's upset, and yeah, you can understand why she's upset because this isn't fair. I think it's pretty obvious to see that more parents than not are going to fall into the latter category. They're going to be upset. They're going to look at this and they're going to see this as a fairness issue, not as a teaching opportunity to show additional respect and tolerance for people who are going through a lot of difficulties in their life, or going through potentially difficulties and upheaval in their life. So I think it's pretty understandable to see why the polling numbers are favoring the side that is against allowing trans women to compete in athletics. But it goes beyond that, because it's not just the parents of those daughters, it's the parents of any daughter who think that, well, my daughter might one day be in that situation, or people who aren't even parents yet, but are thinking of, well, someday I may have a daughter who is going to be in that situation, or even people who don't have any kids and don't plan to ever have any kids, but haven't, again, given this a great deal of thought. I think it's pretty natural for the whole fairness reaction, the whole this doesn't seem right, this doesn't seem well thought through, the consequences of this are clearly much worse in one case than they are in the other case, because a lot more young women who are not trans women are going to be hurt by deciding to allow trans women to compete, as opposed to the relatively few currently number of trans women who do want to compete being the ones who are hurt. So there's no there's no easy solution here that nobody comes away as a loser, right? But from a policy standpoint, we've already talked about whether or not this does indeed make young women who want to compete in athletics a loser. But from a messaging standpoint, I think it's also pretty clear why so many people would think that this would make young women a loser. Like, again, this doesn't seem like a particularly difficult message for those on the right, those who would like, well, quite frankly, those who tend to speak in a very non-tolerant, very non-respectful, very non-dignified way about the trans community, which unfortunately is the world we live in right now. It basically is giving them ammunition, and people's natural instinct, I think, is going to be to agree with them. And it's a shame because it's issues like this where I think the hearts of Democrats may be in the right place, but the consequences haven't been particularly well thought through. That ends up hurting them at the polls. And I think that this is really an example of maybe several different issues where there needs to be a little bit of self-reflection here. There needs to be a little bit of this asking yourselves, is this good policy but bad messaging? If that's what I believe it is there something we can do to improve the messaging? Or alternatively, is this not even good policy? So that's kind of where I'll leave it. Hopefully that makes sense well enough to open things up for discussion. Like I said, perfectly okay with people agreeing with me and with each other as long as it is respectful. I want this to be a place where we can talk about these issues with greater context, greater nuance, and greater acknowledgement of trade-offs than what you're generally going to get in the mainstream media. It's the whole reason why I created this channel. All right, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. But thanks everybody so much for listening. Please let me know what your thoughts are, and we will see you all in the next video.